our guest speaker. Dr. Richard Haass is a veteran diplomat, is a prominent voice on American foreign policy, an established leader of nonprofit institutions. He's in his 19th year as president of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is an independent, nonpartisan think tank which helps people better understand the world and the foreign policy choices made by the United States and other countries. From January 2001 to June 2003, Dr. Haass was director of policy planning for the Department of State. He was a principal advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell. Dr. Haass also served as U.S. coordinator for policy towards the future of Afghanistan and U.S. envoy to Northern Ireland peace process. In 2013, Dr. Haass served as the chair of the multi-party negotiations in Northern Ireland. He served at the Department of State and Department of Defense. He's the author of 14 books on American foreign policy, and his recent book is The World, A Brief Introduction, was published by Penguin Press. Dr. Haass, welcome.
Good to be with you. Thank you for the introduction, and I look forward to the conversation.
Dr. Haass, I want to start with a general question about diplomacy. Based on your writing and your conversations in the media, I know you strongly believe in diplomacy and engagement with friends and rivals. You knew John Mroz personally, and I think John Mroz shared these values with you in your belief in diplomacy. Can you talk about the importance of diplomatic efforts and in dealing with other countries to address global challenges?
Sure, and it's a personal pleasure to be associated with something that's associated with John. So it's an extra reason I'm glad to be able to do this tonight. Look, diplomacy needs to be understood as a tool of national security. One often thinks of military tools or economic tools, sanctions, or intelligence. But diplomacy, to me, is every bit as important a tool. It comes in many shapes and sizes and many forms. It can be done publicly. It can be done privately. It can be negotiations, but also can be consultations. And the conversations, but in particular with allies or would-be allies, or in some cases with adversaries or would-be adversaries, in order to try to shape behavior. So to me, it's the daily substance of statecraft, if you will, because I always think of the principal purpose of foreign policy is to shape the external behavior of other actors. And diplomacy is one of the principal ways we get to do it. Often there's an element of persuasion there, but also it's often most effective when it's used in tandem with other tools. If you think of how I began, you've got a kit bag, a toolkit, and you've got military in many forms. You've got economic in many forms. You've got intelligence. You've got aid. But again, diplomacy used in conjunction with other tools seems to me an essential feature of a potentially successful or effective foreign policy.
Absolutely. Your recent book, The World, A Brief Introduction, it's an important primer to help us make sense of the world, of the complexities of events happening beyond our borders, and to understand the challenges of today's world. You start the book with the premise that you want people to become more globally literate. Why do you think global literacy is important for Americans, for foreigners, for students and non-students? Why should Americans be interested in the world outside of our borders and learn about it?
Just to be clear, when I talk about global literacy, I'm not talking about global reading rates. Turns out it's about 85% of the people in the world can read, which leaves about 1 billion people who cannot. What I'm talking about is really understanding of the world, knowledge of the world, familiarity with the world, about how it operates and why it matters. One doesn't have to look very far these days to appreciate why it matters. Think about it. We are living with and dying from a virus that began where? In Wuhan, China, however it began. And it traveled around the world, and it's had an extraordinary physical as well as social and economic impact. We just marked the 20th anniversary of what, 9/11, when hijackers from the Middle East, organized out of Afghanistan, killed 3,000 people in a single day. Climate change. The world's temperature has already gone up over 1 degree Celsius, 2 degrees Fahrenheit. We see fires, we see floods, we see droughts, we see increased numbers of internally displaced and refugees. Why? The cumulative effect of the release of certain gases, carbon dioxide and methane in particular, that have raised the overall temperature of the atmosphere and the oceans. And what all these things have in common is that they don't respect borders, that the notion of there versus here breaks down. The notion of local breaks down because very little stays local or geographically limited for long. And what I've just said applies to any number of other things, cyberspace, proliferation, and so forth. So even if your principal concern, as it might be for many people here with us today, even if your principal concern is your domestic well-being, your own particular life, going to work, going to school, your family, your friends, your neighborhoods, even if that's what you worry about or focus on, what goes on elsewhere will have an enormous impact on that. So the beginning of wisdom here, I think, is an appreciation that borders are not barriers. I don't even like the phrase foreign policy in some ways because it suggests it's foreign. Well, foreign policy isn't so foreign. And that's the second part of it, is that the world matters, what we do in the world matters. Globalization, I would say, is a reality. Stuff moves, all sorts of things move at great velocity, great volume across borders. Now, where there's a choice is how we respond to it. And the reason I think it's so important to be informed, to be globally literate, is to make knowledgeable choices about policies. And in the face of politics, about which individuals or parties you might support or prefer, because again, it's consequential. And just so whether it's for your own welfare or for your family, your coworkers, or your countries, it's important to understand the world, because what happens out there will affect here, and there's a loop. And whatever it is we choose to do, particularly the United States, because we have such power and potential influence, what it is we choose to do and how we do it or choose not to do also has consequences on the world. So this is the reality of living in the 21st century. And if you think about your students, they were born roughly 2 decades ago. Their lives, they will have 21st century lives. And more than any other time in human history, their lives will be shaped and informed by what happens all over the world.
Absolutely. So it's not a choice, based on what you're saying, it's not a choice whether we embrace these ideas. We live in this globalized world, but our choice is how to respond. And so it seems like this idea of global fluency and global literacy is an important aspect there. I want to ask you about the peace process in the Middle East. John Mroz spent several decades working on track 2 diplomacy in the Middle East. The region remains an unresolved puzzle today. Based on your book, it seems that you are not very optimistic about this stability and peace process in the Middle East. You finished the section on the Middle East with this seemingly grim outlook that in the near future, we're likely to see more instability. What are the main obstacles to peace and stability in this region?
It's hard to generalize about peace and stability in the Middle East because you have instability caused by failed states, by civil wars that are exacerbated by external actors, by actors that aren't states, militias, and the like, and so forth. So let me answer you, put on my academic hat and try to separate it into 2 different clusters of issues, if I may. When one talks about stability anywhere, Europe, Asia, the Middle East, in the traditional sense of the word, if one looks at the writings of the classical thinkers in our field, the Hedley Bulls, the Henry Kissingers, and others, what comes to the fore are 2 ideas. There needs to be a balance of power. and there needs to be some acceptance of arrangements. And so either people voluntarily accept those arrangements, or if they don't like them, the balance of power is such as they're either not tempted to try to change them through force, or they fail if they do. I would simply say those preconditions don't exist in certain parts of the Middle East. Second of all, when it comes to traditional peace processes, when people often speak of the Middle East peace process, they talk about, in particular, Israelis and Palestinians. Often historically, they talk about Israel and the Arab states. In any peace process, and I've participated in this. I have been the U.S. envoy to Northern Ireland. I've been the U.S. envoy to Cyprus. I have been involved in Middle East negotiations of all sorts. I have been involved in Indo-Pakistani negotiations of all sorts. You'll notice what these things have in common. I've not succeeded anywhere, so now you're going to get the perspective of someone who's serially failed at all these things to one extent or another. In order for there to be success in a classical negotiation, more than anything else, you need leaders on the various sides, whether it's two or more sides, who are one, willing, and two, able to make a deal, to essentially compromise. When I say willing, they've got to be open to it, and able, they've got to be in a political position, given their constituency, that they can sell it and make it stick. That if they make commitments, they can follow through on. I would simply say, if one looks at Israelis and Palestinians over the last couple of decades, you've not had that. You've not had Israeli governments that have been willing, in some cases politically able to make compromises. That's certainly the case on the Palestinian side, the division between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, weak leadership, ideology. So you don't have the preconditions. Now, where you have the preconditions, you had it, say, between Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, where you had leaders who were willing and able to make compromises and sell them and make them stick. You can have peace. When you think about the peaceful end to apartheid in South Africa, you had F.W. Clerk and you had Nelson Mandela. So successful peacemaking requires this feature of leadership. People focus all the time on the details of the agreement. As complicated as that can be, that's often the least complicated thing. The question is how you bring about a context in which negotiations can succeed. So between Israelis and Palestinians, you don't have that. You have had it in recent years between Israel and some of its neighboring states. You had it years ago with Egypt and Jordan. More recently, at the Abraham Accords, you've had it with the UAE and I think Morocco. You could have it one day with Saudi Arabia, and I think that would be an important accomplishment. But we're not close between Israelis and Palestinians. And the corollary to what you say, Max, is Tony Blinken could get up in the morning, the Secretary of State, and say, I'm going to make this my priority. And he could devote 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to it, and he wouldn't succeed. Diplomats need raw material to work with. So where you have what I would call the preconditions of success, what I, in another book, termed ripeness, R-I-P-E-N-E-S-S, then an effective diplomat can work with that. One of my colleagues, Martin Indyk, has a book coming out either this week or next week on Henry Kissinger in the Middle East, and talks about Henry Kissinger worked with Anwar Sadat and others after the 1973 war, and brokered ceasefires between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Syria. So an effective diplomat can make a difference, but an effective diplomat cannot substitute for a lack of ripeness. So right now, no matter how talented an envoy, he or she would not or could not succeed in bringing Israelis and Palestinians to a successful point, simply because you don't have the raw material right now to work with. And in other areas, I would simply say, again, I'm not sure you have the preconditions in terms, again, of a balance of power and a common agreement as to what is legitimate or acceptable. So that's why I'm so pessimistic about the Middle East. Now that could change, but we are going to have some tests, not simply between Israelis and Palestinians ultimately, but also I think with Iran. And I think the question of what happens there could be front and center and become the newest challenge to order in the Middle East.
So it's it's structural conditions. It's also the agency, the decisions of individuals. The decisions of individuals are not enough. And so we need some deeper conditions here with commitments and what you're calling the rightness.
No, absolutely. And again, envoys, diplomats, mediators can often supply the last 5 or 10% if they're really good. But the first 90% has to come from the local actors themselves and from the context in which they're acting in. Envoys are not miracle makers. They can make a difference, but really it's in my experience, I'm hard pressed to think of someone who made a decisive difference. Again, what's decisive is, in the case of even Kissinger, it was the '73 war that changed inclinations to compromise and abilities to compromise on the parts of Israelis, Syrians, and Egyptians. It could not have, no amount of shuttling could have succeeded before the '73 conflict changed the context of any negotiating effort.
You also mentioned the acceptance of arrangements, and it seems that you're hinting at this idea of global order that is a recurring theme in your book. The world order seems to be, so you keep coming back to this idea, and you're arguing in the book that the US is important in maintaining liberal global order, but has done little or not enough, has done missteps in Afghanistan and Iraq, has overreached, but then hasn't really done much since then. Can you talk about the role of the U.S. in this,
Sure,
in the maintenance of global order, in acceptance of arrangements? If not the U.S., who is out there? Whose role is it to maintain world order?
no, it's an important point. The first thing to say is that order is not the natural state of things. Anyone who has studied history will know that the natural state of things is not peaceful. It's not peace and prosperity and human rights and democracy and the rest. Conflict is far more the norm. Uses of military force, illiberalism rather than liberalism in the classic sense. Now, the last 75 years since World War II have been a remarkable stretch of history, a remarkable run. And it didn't just happen. It happened in no small part because of the efforts and leadership of the United States, not acting alone, but as I say, leadership, forging alliances, forging international institutions, and then supporting them, advocating for certain norms, backing them up when need be. And it's been a remarkable run in history. If you look at the last 70, 75 years, you haven't had great power conflict in a direct sense, unlike, say, the first half of the 20th century when we had it twice. You've had remarkable increases in wealth, standards of living around the world. The average person in the world lives, one or more, in some cases, 2 or 3 decades longer. Countries became independent after World War II, again later, after say the breakup of the Soviet Union. Until at least 15 years ago, you had an expansion of democracy and human rights in much of it. It was as remarkable a run of history as has ever been seen. And again, it didn't just happen. It took the United States leading alliances, creating conditions where the Soviet Union understood that the use of force would not serve its interests. So the Cold War stayed cold for the most part. There were certain ground rules where conflicts did break out about putting ceilings on them, about the roles of the rival great powers. But what's happening now, and I think it's happened gradually over the last decade or so, and it's accelerated, is the United States is having second and third thoughts about playing such a large role in the world. It began, I think, in the Obama administration. It accelerated dramatically in the Trump administration, and it's continuing to a large extent in the Biden administration. But real questions about how important the world should be, that everyone's obviously aware of our domestic needs and shortcomings and problems. So there's a desire to focus here. There's a collective sense across party lines say that we ought to have gotten out of Afghanistan. The Trump administration signed the agreement with the Taliban. The Biden administration largely implemented it. There's a sense that after Iraq and Afghanistan, we ought to dial down significantly our military involvement in the greater Middle East. There's no enthusiasm I can see in either party for entering into trade agreements. The United States helped design and formed the Trans-Pacific Partnership and then walked away from it. And right now, there wouldn't be support in either party to join it. So I think there's real questions about our willingness to play the sort of role that we have played. And I would simply say, if we're not willing to do it, I don't see anybody else willing and able to step into our shoes. And I think that's simply a fact of life, that you would end up with a very different kind of world. It would be a world, I think, of spheres of influence, of more frequent conflict. But the idea of having global arrangements that worked against conflict and worked on behalf of certain rules or norms, certain freedoms, I simply don't think would happen without the United States playing a significant role. I don't know if something's going on there with the screens, because I'm seeing all sorts of things, but hopefully you're still hearing me and seeing me, but I'll leave that to you.
Hey, I'm hearing you. We had some problem, I think, with another guest.
Okay.
But I think we're good. We have a question. I want to remind everyone, if you have a question for Dr. Haass, please use the chat feature for this. And I want to encourage our students to ask questions. I want to encourage our global ambassadors to ask questions. Meanwhile, we have a question from a colleague. In consideration of how important statecraft is, should the United States significantly increase the budget for the State Department? What are the main obstacles for increasing our federal budget for the Department of State?
The budget of the Department of State, when it comes actually to the training and supporting of diplomats, is minuscule in the overall federal budget or in the U.S. economy. So yes, we ought to do more. Indeed, one of the historic problems of the State Department is that it did not invest nearly enough in its own people. If you look at how the military systematically invests in its people, in developing talent, leadership, you don't see anything remotely comparable in the State Department. So yes, we need, it needs more resources, but that's not going to solve the problem. We need the best and the brightest to go into this. In my generation, a lot of young people thought that this was the most interesting and important thing to do, to join the government. I think now a lot of people are more inclined to go into the financial sector or do something else. So we've got to make public service exciting again, rewarding. I think we need to treat people in government with respect. We need to stop using phrases like deep state and instead talk about people choosing to serve their country. That's what this is about. We ought to, again, as I said, provide more resources in terms of training and career development. But also important is in the councils of decision-making that diplomacy get the due it deserves. I think we're often too quick to think about military approaches. We're not using, several, you just give you one example, several recent secretaries of defense, from Bob Gates to Ash Carter, would say things like, I'd much prefer the United States to enter into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I'd take that over another aircraft carrier battle group. What we end up often doing is giving short shrift to the diplomatic side of our foreign policy and national security, and instead rely too much on other things. We ought to have more money for aid. People complain about China's Belt and Road Initiative and China's reach. Well, you can't beat something with nothing. If we want to get out there, then let's have more resources that we can compete with. But it's also not all about resources. We want to promote democracy. The single best thing we could do is make American democracy look more appealing and more successful. The most successful and most important thing we can do there is provide a system and an example that others want to emulate. So that's not a matter of statecraft. That's a matter of who we are and how we conduct ourselves. But I'm not fighting the basic point. I would like to see diplomacy elevated. I'd like to see in the interagency councils that diplomacy get the emphasis it deserves. I would like the most talented young people to think of doing it either as foreign service officers in the intelligence community, lots of ways to get into it, to study it as academics, to get involved as journalists, to go work for NGOs, to be in corporate America. In 2 weeks, we're starting a big international conference on climate. What corporations do could be every bit as important, if not more important, as what the US government does. So there's lots of ways to become a factor in international relations, but I'm not fighting the thrust of the question is yes, we ought to put a greater emphasis on our diplomats, be they career or the political appointees.
Do you think we recovered? Do you think the Foreign Service recovered after the attacks from previous couple of years on its individual members?
No, the foreign state. You've had real problems with recruiting. You had real problems with retention. So we've not brought in a sufficient number of really talented young people, and we've lost way too many people who retired early. So the problem is not just that diplomats didn't have impact, but we lost the necessary inflow. And again, we prematurely lost way too many experienced hands. That'll take a decade or 2 decades to fix. You can't lose that amount of talent and not pay a price for it. So the State Department, if you think about it, the Foreign Service, Diplomatic Corps, that's an institution. Institutions are like super tankers. They don't turn on dimes. So what it will take is years of sustained effort to attract the most talented young Americans, then years and years of giving them good experiences and training them up and so forth. And so they'll stay. So this is the work. If you think about what the Army did after Vietnam, that's the analogy to use. And that took a generation. So we're in a generational struggle to get the Foreign Service and the State Department back where it needs to be.
Very good. We have a couple of questions from our students and from our audience. Kate, would you like to ask your question? Kate Coffey.
Hi, yes. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm really wondering, what were some impactful decisions you made in your education and early in your career that have helped kind of lead you on this path of success?
Well, the first thing I'd say is it wasn't planned. And I know lots of people early on in their lives, whether it's students or in the decade afterwards, when they're in their 20s, feel pressure to sort it all out and figure it out. And I'm several decades, to say the least, beyond that, and I'm not sure I figured it out yet. So part of it is to make the decision to do what's interesting and to choose, particularly early on, positions where you'll learn the most. I actually think tooling up, building capacity in yourself early on in your life is great. The way I got into this in the first place was totally by happenstance. I was a freshman at college at Oberlin College in Ohio. And I didn't know what I wanted to study particularly or major in. And I asked around and I asked who was the best professor on campus. And several people suggested this one professor, Professor Frank, who taught on New Testament. And my reaction to that was, well, that's interesting. We never got around to that one in our house, but I'm game. I will ready to learn about it, and took it. Thought it, like any great teacher, a great teacher can make watching paint dry interesting. He was a great teacher. In this case, it was a lot inherently interesting as well. And through that, I went with him to do an archaeological dig and decided to spend a junior year abroad in Israel, and came back and decided to major in Middle Eastern studies, and went to graduate school and decided to work in international relations. And it just happened. And it got really interesting. And I studied a lot of history and got more and more interested in it. And then I thought I was going to go on to be an academic and be a professor. And then after I was finished my graduate work, I was temporarily working at a think tank in London. I gave a paper at a conference, and someone was at the conference and said, "Hey, that was pretty interesting. Why don't you come work with us?" And I said, "Sure. Where do you work?" And they said, "The Pentagon." So I said, "Okay." So a few months later, I hopped on a plane to Washington, D.C. and worked on at the Pentagon. And half a year later, 2 big things happened. This is 1979. 2 big events. One was you had a revolution in Iran, takeover of the American embassy. And second of all, you had the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It just so turned out that I had written my doctoral thesis on that part of the world. So I was actually there. I was not even, I was in my late 20s. And I was one of the few people sitting around that five-sided building who had a lot of knowledge of and experience with that part of the world. Had been to all these countries, had studied them, written about them. So one thing led to another. And again, it wasn't by design. It just sort of happened. And I don't want to take up too much time going down memory lane. One of the great things in the United States is that the ability to go in and out of government. And I've now worked for 4 presidents. I've also worked on the Hill with the Congress. So it's great to get those kinds of experiences. And I just think, I lead a think tank now, the Council on Foreign Relations. I look for people who are what I would call scholar practitioners. People who have academic backgrounds, but also have mixed them up with quote unquote real world experience, be it in government, business, with NGOs. So what I would say for young people is, particularly early on in your 20s, at college, I'd say follow the best professors, read as much history as you can, get schooled. And then afterwards, think of your 20s as a chance to take 3 or 4 or 5 different jobs of a couple of years each and expose yourself to things. You'll learn, and you'll also figure out what's not right for you as well as what's right for you. And don't feel the pressure to find the right thing. I always used to be uneasy when I met people who were 16 years old and telling me they wanted to be orthopedic surgeons. That was kind of early on to be so specialized, I thought. So I'd almost recommend the same thing. Give yourself some time and space, expose yourself to all sorts of things. And your biggest criteria should be do stuff where you learn a lot. Find really good teachers, mentors. And as soon as the learning curve flattens out, move on and find the next experience. And gradually, you will, I think, get closer and closer to what's right for you.
We have a question from Liza. Liza, Malcolm, do you want to ask your question?
Liza, I'm sure it's a great question, but you have to unmute yourself.
All right, well, I can't hear Liza, but it's also a question that is related to John Buggy's question. So Liza was interested about in the disruption of U.S. foreign policy set in motion by the Trump administration. And she's interested to know whether this disruption will persist and if this mark will ever fade. And John Buggy was asking about your career in the Council of Foreign Relations, about one highlight, what has been its highlight, and what your hope or for future goals of the Council on Foreign Relations.
Okay, 2 very different questions. I have a piece coming out, I think next week. We published the magazine Foreign Affairs, which I hope the students make a habit of reading, both the magazine and also go to the website, foreignaffairs.com. And the piece, I argue that there's actually tremendous continuity among the Obama, Trump, and Biden presidencies, that you sandpaper off some of the rhetorical differences. And there's actually a lot more continuity. All 3 are reactions to what was perceived as the overreach of George W. Bush in Afghanistan and Iraq. Increasingly, certainly the last 2 presidents, Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden, have taken a very muscular stance towards China. They both have backed away from American participation in free trade agreements. Both were anxious to get out of Afghanistan and back away from the Middle East. There are some differences, say, about democracy or climate change, but we'll see how big the differences actually are in reality. I am quite skeptical to say the least. And I think so. My point is simply that yes, Mr. Trump was rather extreme in his use of Twitter and in his language at times and his style. But substantively, I think there's more continuity among these presidents than is understood, which suggests to me it's likely to last. That what we finally stumbled on or into is what I would call a post-Cold War American foreign policy. And we're seeing the outlines. It is more nationalist. Biden administration has buy American provisions in competitiveness law. Lots of trade sanctions have remained in place. Our willingness to provide vaccines to the world, I would simply say, has been awfully limited and slow. And I could go on. So I take this seriously. So whether Mr. Trump is reelected in 3.5 years or not, I think some of the direction of American foreign policy is pretty clear and is more likely to continue on that. So in that case, Mr. Trump becomes as much a reflection of a trend that's now been in place for a decade plus, and not simply an aberration. So what this means is, even though now we're in a post-Trump period, and I don't know in 3 years what will happen, I would simply say some of the outlines of the foreign policy will continue no matter what happens in the 2024 elections. Again, I'm not sitting here and saying there won't be differences. Of course there will, but there'll also be, again, surprising continuity in some important areas, regardless of the 2024 result. I think the changes are much more dramatic in domestic policy, in terms of our economy, in terms of our democracy, than they are in our foreign policy. In terms of the council, I would say, yeah, the council's in its 100th year. We were formed after World War I. The whole idea was to, this was at the time of the American rejection of membership in the League of Nations. It was brought together by, council was formed by a group of men, largely in the Northeast. And the whole idea was to promote an active United States in the world. 100 years later, we're an institution of 5,000 members all across the country, men, women. We're diverse by virtually any and every measure of the word. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of meetings a year. 2 websites, CFR.org and foreignaffairs.com. We publish the leading journal in the field, and we're also become what I think is the leading educator, particularly for young Americans, but Americans of any age, about the world. We have model diplomacy, a simulation. We have World 101, an entire curriculum that will actually be completed in the next 2 or 3 months. And you'll have online for free an entire curriculum that in many ways tracks some of the themes in my most recent book, The World, A Brief Introduction. And that's what's different about the council. What I feel best about is we've continued to be what I would call an elite institution. We have tried to frame the foreign policy conversation among professionals in the government, in Congress, journalists, the business community, people who do this for a living, academics. But we've also tried to be a resource for Americans across the board. People for whom foreign policy is not a full-time preoccupation, it's not even a priority. But going back to where we began the conversation, in order to create a much larger number of informed citizens, in order to raise the level of global literacy in the United States. So we're now working at, if you will, multiple levels with multiple constituencies, and I feel good about that. I feel good about the fact we've taken on a larger social and national role in the United States alongside our traditional role.
We have a question from a colleague from Brian Ganaway. Thank you for this defense of diplomacy. I would like to know how you view the role of the military-industrial complex in American foreign policy. Do you see a conflict between diplomacy, American military power, and the arms industry global interests?
I don't. I know President Eisenhower warned about the military-industrial complex, and on one level, it's there in the sense that it's not simply that we spend significantly on the military, but by the way, excuse me, the percentage of our GDP that we spend on the military now is only about 50 or 60% what we averaged during the Cold War. So as large as the absolute numbers are, the relative priority we're spending on the military has gone down significantly. My view is the quote unquote military industrial complex influences the weapon systems we buy, which explains in many cases why we have too small a number of very advanced and too, what I would say, expensive systems. That's their biggest impact. A little bit of an impact on overall budget levels, not that much. Have almost no impact on policy decisions. I've been Again, I've worked in 4 administrations, the Pentagon, the White House, the State Department. I've been involved in decisions to either go or not to go into conflict maybe more than a dozen times. And there's not a voice for the military-industrial complex. Where it's largely determined by, almost exclusively determined by civilians within the executive branch. Military has an influence, but the military's influence, uniform military, is more over how we do things, not whether we do things. And the so-called military-industrial complex is essentially irrelevant to decisions about whether we got out of Afghanistan, whether we got into it, when we did, or how we did it, the 2003 Iraq War, the decision in 1990 and 91 to resist Saddam Hussein's invasion and occupation of Kuwait, what we did in the Balkans. I could just go on and on and on. So it has to do, again, the so-called military-industrial complex influences procurement, mainly the details, which explains, again, why we have too many expensive platforms and not a larger number of platforms. It has almost nothing to do with basic questions of foreign policy and national security policy.
We have a question from one of our global ambassadors. That's a cohort of students who are interested in foreign service. Zoe, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you for the virtual visit as well. I was wondering if you think it would be beneficial for a more equal balance of leadership from varying countries in international relationships, rather than predominantly depending on the US to fill that role, and if that is even possible.
Again, I mean, the US constitutes now roughly what, 20-25% of global GDP. It's the world's most capable military, but there's virtually nothing we do unilaterally. We do it with others. So I think there's an element of collective action or inaction. I think there's 2 separate questions, though. One is the decision-making about what is done, and then there's the question about how burdens and responsibilities are divided up. And I think, there's long been a desire in this country that we maximize our influence and maximize the contributions of others. A little bit of tension there. In my experience, others are willing to often do more, but they also want to have more of a say. And the question is, are we willing to do it? And I would basically argue in many cases, we should be open to that in principle. We have to see in detail what the consensus would be, and then what others are really prepared to do. In many cases, I'm skeptical they would actually do a lot more. But I think the fact is, we can't impose our will. So when it comes to what's going to happen on climate change, just to take one example, the United States can do certain things at home. We're not doing all the things, to say the least, we could and should. We can encourage others to do certain things. Again, we're not doing anything like all we could, and I would argue should be, to incentivize people to act in certain ways or penalize them if we don't. But I don't. If we do less, I guess my view is I don't see others doing more per se. And if others were to do more, it may not be the others you want, or it may not be the more you want. If we create spaces because we do less, we shouldn't assume that benign forces will fill them. And I think we see that in parts of the Middle East and elsewhere. When the United States dials down, it's not necessarily good guys who share or positive agendas who step up. Often it's just the opposite.
We have a couple of questions about different parts of the world. One of the questions is from Karen Mroz. Dr. Haass, thank you for speaking in the inaugural series of the Mroz Institute. John was a proud member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Would you share your view on the situation in Syria in the short term, and what role might the US play, if any? And a different question is on Taiwan and about potential casualties, about another Tiananmen Square and lessons to be learned there.
Thank you, Karen. Yes, it was great having John in our midst for as long as we did. in terms of Syria, I think historians can and will argue whether a moment ever existed that certain things could have been accomplished at reasonable prices. Those days have long since passed. And so I think the real question now, and it's one that leaves me uncomfortable, is I don't think Mr. Assad can be dislodged. And the real question is, can we leverage support that Syria so dearly needs for changes in how the country is governed, in terms of the relationship between the central government and the rest of the country, and so forth. The United States, though, we have potentially economic leverage there, a little bit of diplomatic, but we've lost most of our leverage by having left. And I would say Iran, Russia, and others have more leverage than we do. So I don't think there's a whole lot that can be done, which is tragic, given what's happened to Syria. And like I said, we can argue or look back on whether there were moments, whether there were windows or opportunities that were forfeited, where had the United States done things. For example, when Syria did use chemical weapons and President Obama threatened severe consequences, and the severe consequences never came. Imagine we had taken out the Syrian Air Force then, or done something else. This was, by the way, before you had Soviet and before you had Russian military intervention. What would have been the consequences then? So I advocated doing more at the time. What I couldn't tell you then, and I can't tell you now, is how had we done that, what would have ensued? And just because we had beaten back the government at that point, it was impossible to know what forces, because it really, in the plural, might have taken advantage of a weakened government. And not all of them would have been benign. By and large, civil wars like this don't bring to the fore good guys. And Syria has become a battleground of any number of bad guys, local, regional, and global. So I think it's a long time before it looks anything like a normal country. But my guess is for the foreseeable future, we've got to deal with the existing leadership. And the real question is, can we leverage the help it so sorely needs for certain behavioral changes? And again, I don't follow it closely enough anymore to know whether we can, but that's the direction I'd go. But I think there's no chance we're going to get back on the ground or something like that. I think that ship has sailed. And I think Zoe or someone else asked before about doing less. This is a good example. When the United States dialed down, other places dialed up, including Russia, including Iran. And I would simply say the consequences have not been benign or positive as a result. You asked about Taiwan and China. I could talk about that for hours, but don't worry, I won't. Look, the US-China relationship is the most significant of this era of history. And within that relationship, Taiwan is the most dangerous potential flashpoint. That's nothing new. When the United States and China formed their modern relationship, by China, I mean the People's Republic of China, Communist China, 4 or 5 decades ago, even then we had to agree to disagree about Taiwan. And if you go back and if you're interested in this, you read the so-called 3 communiques, you read the Taiwan Relations Act, which is a piece of American legislation. You read what are known as the 6 assurances from the United States and Taiwan. There's an entire diplomatic literature on this. It's actually a brilliant piece of statecraft. What's happened is for 4 decades plus, the United States, China, and Taiwan, these 3 entities, have finessed their differences. We often use the word. Some people say, "What about the Taiwan problem?" And when I begin with it, I say, "Don't call it a problem, because problems have solutions." And this is more a situation. And the United States and China and Taiwan have finessed or managed their situation. To use the parlance of the Middle East, they've avoided final status outcomes which would be unacceptable to one or more of the parties. And instead, they've lived with a degree of uncertainty. And they've set certain parameters on their behavior. And essentially, Taiwan has understood that it cannot do things like declare its independence. And the mainland has understood it cannot use force to subjugate Taiwan, to bring, and so forth. And the United States has, again, acted consistent with that. And the question is, has what worked for 4 or 5 decades, can it continue to work? And it's not clear. And the mainland has gotten much more powerful militarily, seems to be getting somewhat impatient about this. Taiwan has become much more autonomous. The population shows less and less interest of ever becoming part of China under any circumstances. So the question is, has the possibility of the use of force gone up? Answer, yes. And so the challenge for the United States, I think, is how do we avoid this in a way that we still maintain our obligations vis-a-vis Taiwan? So how do we avoid a coercive outcome by the mainland, but also avoid a war, which would be ruinous to the region and the world? And I would say there's things I believe we ought to do in the way increasing deterrence, increasing military capabilities in the region, but I also believe there are things we can do to reassure the mainland. This will be a real test of statecraft, and going back to where we began, this will be a real test of our ability to blend the various instruments of national security. There's a diplomatic dimension here, obviously, there's a military dimension, there's an economic dimension. I think it's really important that China understand that if it were to use force, it would pay an enormous economic price. That ought to constitute some of the deterrent here. So this is a textbook case of statecraft or diplomacy. It's actually great in or out of the classroom, and it's become very real world. This is not something that's somehow remote, either in terms of likelihood or time. This has come front and center, and in some ways has emerged as the most important statecraft challenge, or on the short list of most important challenges facing the United States and if you will, facing the world. So it's an important issue.
Well, we have a couple of minutes left, enough for at least one more question. I want to ask you about Afghanistan. Afghanistan remains the elephant in the room, and I want to hear your perspective on the new government. Al Jazeera reported yesterday that Taliban held its first face-to-face talks with US and EU delegation. Russia and China sent their representatives. And Afghanistan today is experiencing a major humanitarian crisis with food prices, with bank assets, with civil servants who are not paid. How should the US and the rest of the world interact with the Taliban? Is not recognizing Taliban an attractive option for us? And what does that mean? Well, what will that mean for citizens of Afghanistan?
I don't know who first said it, but when it comes to a place like Afghanistan, we are where we are where we are. I don't much like where we are. I don't think it was inevitable that we would reach this point. I think we've made all sorts of mistakes across administrations. I think we've done too much in Afghanistan. I think we've done too little. I think we've done too many of the wrong things. But we are where we are where we are. Here it is, late to 2021. So we can leave all that, and there's a lot of learning to be done, a lot of lessons to be gleaned. It's great classroom material. But you asked about where we are now. So I would say you've got a government in Afghanistan, and as you correctly say, Max, faces a terrible humanitarian crisis. You've got millions of people who are internally displaced. You've got the potential for massive drug production and trafficking, the potential for refugee flows beyond the country's borders. The last thing in the world we want to see are more terrorists come to Afghanistan, or the terrorists who are there be able to operate out of it. We've got concerns about human rights, the treatment of women and girls. It's a long, long, long list. The winter's coming. You could have mass starvation, hardship. So I would say what we ought to do is, in these talks, have a very practical, non-ideological approach to the Taliban, and try to set up what I would call a transactional relationship. And basically say, if you do X or don't do Y, here's what we are prepared to do. And this might deal with everything from treatment of girls and women to how they approach terrorists, to drug production, to you name it. And I think it'd be useful if the United States, certainly, and the EU, and as many others as we could get, had a united front. And so we have to live with the Taliban for now. They made certain commitments. We should hold them to those commitments, particularly about not trafficking, if you will, with terrorists. And we have real concerns about how they're going to govern their country. So I think we have to decide what our priorities are. To put it bluntly, to what extent are our priorities how they deal with terrorism? To what extent are our priorities how they deal with drugs, opium production? To what extent are our priorities about how they deal with human rights, particularly the human rights of girls and women? And how we are going to, it's everything then from economic aid to diplomatic recognition. So I would set up a comprehensive conversation with them, and I would be transactional or conditional in all that we did or didn't do going forward. And I would concert this. I would not do this unilaterally. Afghanistan has 6 immediate neighbors. There's as well the EU, other countries that have a large role, including potentially India. And this again is a different kind of foreign policy or diplomatic or statecraft challenge, but that's where we are. So I think going forward, we have to do what I just described, and I would avoid the 2 extremes, by the way, of having nothing to do with them, or the extremes of or the other extreme of dealing with them unconditionally. I would basically be solidly in between. But I also think we need to, when we have the moment, take stock of what happened and learn from it, because the United States sacrificed an enormous amount in terms of life and treasure and time there, and we have got to learn what I would call the right lessons, and that to me is important going forward.
Thank you very much. We're out of time. Thank you, Dr. Haass, for your insight and for this important conversation. We really appreciate your time that you spend this hour with us.
Thank you, Max. Thank you, John, and thank you all. Great to be with you tonight. Sorry it's virtually, as I'm a great fan of that city you find yourselves in.
We look forward to having you here in person.